Hello, my friends. And Zelensky is back in London again, this time for yet another meeting with top Western politicians so they can posture around the so-called peace plan. We are told the West now magically wants peace, that it seeks an end to the conflict with Russia. Yet nothing in its behavior, absolutely nothing, suggests sincerity. While Western officials leak stories about giving Zelensky a very difficult call over the weekend, there is no real reality check in Washington, London, Berlin, or Paris. Meanwhile, Russia is making steady, significant advances all along the front, systematically wearing down Kiev's forces. So the real questions are, what does this all mean for the state of the war, and what should we actually be watching on the battlefield? In recent weeks, I've focused a lot on the front around Donetsk and Avdiivka because that is where you see in brutal clarity both the military reality and the moral rot of the Kiev regime. The front line now is roughly 30 kilometers west of Avdiivka. That alone should already silence the crowd in the West who still repeat the lazy phrase stalemate. It is not a stalemate. The lines have moved not as far or as fast as some would like, but they have moved, and in a decisive direction. Avdiivka itself was probably the most heavily fortified fortress city in the entire network of Ukrainian defensive lines. Kiev poured enormous quantities of concrete into it, building trenches, bunkers, and reinforcing the walls of civilian apartment blocks so they could serve as hardened firing positions. From those positions, they relentlessly shelled Donetsk with artillery day after day, year after year. Beginning in 2014, when their attempt to seize Donetsk failed and they were pushed back. People who have not seen Donetsk up close have no idea what these residents have lived through. Even now, Western Donetsk and surrounding districts still take hits from Ukrainian rocket and missile systems. Earlier this year, driving in from the east toward central Donetsk, you can see 3- and 4-story residential buildings completely destroyed by HIMARS-type rockets, typical American precision that somehow always finds apartment houses. These are purely civilian structures, with no military positions anywhere nearby, except for standard air defense systems further west. In the city itself, you can hear the air defense working Panzer batteries firing constantly as they intercept whatever managed to slip through the outer belts and head toward the city center. When you move farther west into districts like Kirovsky, the scale of the damage becomes overwhelming. Long blocks of 5- and 6-story apartment buildings, scarred by direct hits, some partially collapsed, others barely standing, pockmarked with tank and artillery impacts. The striking thing is that despite all this, civilians are still there. People refuse to abandon their homes. Windows are boarded up because real glass is rare if you see any panes. It's usually just shards clinging to twisted frames. Families have come back to their apartments, even in buildings that are structurally unsound and will eventually have to be torn down to the foundations and rebuilt from scratch. In some cases, entire segments of buildings no longer even have a foundation left. In one long block used as a Russian military post after the liberation of Avdiivka, a HIMARS strike simply erased the central section 6 floors high, about 50 meters wide, so completely that there wasn't even rubble in the middle. The explosion disintegrated everything, sending concrete and rebar outward. You see that kind of damage and you realize how little will be salvageable in many of these cities. Avdiivka itself, before the war, had on the order of 70,000 to 100,000 residents. Today, very few remain. Many were forcibly evacuated west by Ukrainian forces. Those who refused were treated as enemy sympathizers and used as human shields. Testimonies from Ukrainian POWs, especially from areas like Marinka, paint an ugly picture. They openly admit they were ordered to kill civilians, to level buildings, even when they knew people were inside, simply because those civilians were waiting for the Russians. Anyone who stayed behind was automatically branded pro-Russian and therefore expendable. These men are not speaking under torture. If anything, their consciences are finally catching up with them. Locals who stayed told Russian soldiers there were many civilian bodies found when clearing operations began. Men, women, children shot or buried in collapsed buildings as Ukrainian units retreated and killed anyone who remained. The city is effectively leveled. Entire blocks of multi-story housing are just hollow carcasses. A few structures remain standing almost miraculously, like a church on the edge of town. If you know European cities, you understand how sharply they end. On one side of a street, you have tall urban buildings. Cross the street, and it's open fields. There is no endless suburban buffer like in the United States. In Avdiivka, that church sits just across from total devastation, destroyed schools, apartment blocks, the priest's residence damaged but still recognizable, while towering residential buildings across the way are shredded or collapsed. For Donetsk, the suffering isn't just from shelling. Water is now a constant struggle. Residents get running water every 2 or 3 days because Ukrainian forces continually target pumping stations, something they've been doing since 2014. The area is relatively dry, with limited groundwater compared to places like Moscow. Historically, a canal from the Dnieper River carried water into the Donbass, but Kiev shut it off. Until Russian forces reach the Dnieper and secure that region, they cannot switch it back on. So the people of Donetsk, already hardened by a decade of war, live with intermittent water, constant danger, and a stubborn refusal to abandon their city. Avdiivka will eventually be rebuilt just as Mariupol is already being rebuilt, but not yet. Today, any major reconstruction effort would be targeted by Ukrainian drones. Those operators, sitting far to the west, do not care whether they hit military engineers, utility crews, hospital workers, or a woman pushing a stroller. Once a drone is launched and its battery is running down, if it cannot find a military target, it will hit whatever is available, an ambulance, a tram, a work crew. That mentality is why Ukrainian drone operators typically do not get the luxury of being taken prisoner. Their work has made them something very different from normal soldiers. One of the reasons the situation has shifted so dramatically is that the entire fortification belt Kiev built over 8 years in the Donbass is largely gone. The fortress cities and towns, the linked trench lines anchored between them, most have been taken or rendered useless. The Donbass basin is heavily industrialized, with coal and steel at its core. Since the 1800s, Russia built factories and mines there. Towns bleed into each other, forming long belts of settlement hundreds of kilometers in length. That density, combined with 8 years of preparation, made offensive operations difficult. But now those static positions are broken. What remains ahead of the Russian advance is mostly open fields with small, poorly prepared villages. These are hard to defend and easy to observe. Any attempt by Ukrainian troops to fortify them is visible not only to drones, but to Russian forward observers calling in glide bombs and thermobaric munitions. Even Ukrainian commanders admit that Russia is dropping roughly 100 to 150 glide bombs a day along certain sectors. These are not just deadly to the men in the target zone, the shock waves collapse trenches and dugouts. When you combine that with dwindling manpower, ammunition shortages, and a collapsing logistical system, you get a front that is not just pressured, but fundamentally unsustainable. There are, by Ukrainian admission, roughly 400,000 desertion cases open. The true number is higher. What's striking is that many deserters are no longer terrified conscripts grabbed off the street, but veterans who understand exactly what awaits them. They know that the only way to leave the battlefield legally is to be wounded badly enough to be carried off, and even then, they may simply be left to bleed out. So they make the only rational choice: take the rifle and disappear. When your veteran corps starts walking away, the poorly trained green troops with minimal training stand no chance of holding a collapsing line. The Russian approach in pockets like Marinka illustrates a broader philosophy. Prioritize your own soldiers' lives. There are Ukrainian units still surrounded there, slowly running out of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Russia could storm these positions at high cost. But why? The encircled troops lack the strength to break out, and Kiev lacks the strength to relieve them. Hunger, cold, untreated wounds, and dwindling morale will do most of the work. Eventually, they will either die in place or surrender. That is how a professional army should think. Take care of your own forces first. There is no prize for sacrificing your men to accelerate an outcome that is already inevitable. If we step back from the front lines and look inside Ukraine itself, we see a society hollowed out. The mobilization system has turned into something approaching open warfare between the regime and its own population. More and more videos leak online of press gangs being confronted and beaten by ordinary people. In Odessa, a bulldog tore into a recruiter while the man fought off another. Bystanders laughed and filmed the scene from multiple angles. In Dnipro, crowds surrounded draft vehicles, smashing them and forcing the recruiters to flee. There are even cases where a driver is stopped at gunpoint by a conscription officer, refuses to comply, and responds with a knife to the throat and pepper spray. This is what the support for the regime looks like now. The old Ukrainian saying, "My hut is at the edge," used to mean people would ignore politics until disaster reached their doorstep. That mentality is changing. Survival increasingly means banding together and fighting back against the regime's enforcers. Villages behind the lines are empty of men. Women who manage to get out describe cemeteries filled with flags in towns with no male population left. Kiev is now talking about lowering the draft age to 18 or 17, but in practice they've already been recruiting 13 and 4-year-olds not by formally conscripting them, but by manipulating them. Teenagers do not truly grasp mortality. They think they're immortal, which is why adolescent boys do reckless things. It is easy to convince such children to be heroes on a battlefield they cannot imagine. On top of that, a growing list of female professions is now subject to registration and potential mobilization. Young women are being trained and deployed as infantry. Any society that feeds its women into the meat grinder has no future. One man with 100 women can, in principle, father 100 children in a year. One woman with one man can only bear one. When the women die in the trenches, the demographic math becomes merciless. Ukraine is bleeding out not only its present, but its future. And for what? For a regime that has sold its population down the river to serve Western interests? The West is terrified that one day the surviving Ukrainians will wake up and realize that the only people who were ever genuinely willing to fight for their long-term security were the very Russians they were told to hate. The Americans, British, and EU apparatchiks love Ukrainians only as long as they are dying for Western geopolitical fantasies. After the war, those same powers will demand debt repayments for generations. That's what really keeps Western elites up at night. The fear of a betrayed, embittered Ukrainian population seeking revenge, not on Moscow, but on its supposed friends. You can see the hollow rhetoric in statements coming out of these meetings. We hear Ukrainian officials repeating that they are fighting for sovereignty and democracy and that any negotiations must secure those values. The irony is almost unbearable. Russia has always wanted a genuinely independent Ukraine, one that is not a NATO forward operating base, not a laboratory for biolabs and color revolutions, not a colony governed by foreign NGOs and Western intelligence services. Ukraine hasn't been sovereign for more than a decade. It has been micromanaged and weaponized by the West against Russia. Meanwhile, Zelensky himself spends less time in Ukraine than a typical U.S. congressman spends in Washington, and that is saying something, given how often Congress is on recess. Zelensky is constantly abroad, shuttling between European capitals, Washington, and global forums, eating and living far better than his own people. Ordinary Italians, for example, are struggling to afford food by the third week of each month, yet their governments still find money to ship weapons and cash to Kiev, money that never reaches the common Ukrainian but vanishes into the pockets of elites on both sides. In Europe, the political class that drives this policy is fundamentally detached from reality. Talk to serious people in Germany and you'll hear the same thing. The elites in Berlin live in a bubble. Many of them have gone straight from university into politics or government service. They have never built a business, never met a payroll, never had to operate in the real economy. The gravy train is often generational families that live in politics. For them, ordinary Germans, Italians, French, or Dutch are essentially peasants, useful only as taxpayers and cannon fodder. They might see them from a limousine window or from a stage when giving a speech, but they do not live among them. That is why these elites feel no shame in crushing protests with police batons and tear gas. When people complain that they can no longer feed their families, heat their homes, or protect their children from reckless policies, including the insane push to draft more men to sustain a war that has nothing to do with defending Europe. Russia has no interest in invading Europe. In fact, if you listen to ordinary Russians today, many would be perfectly happy to build a wall and forget Europe exists. The only territories Russia is fighting over are its historical lands, Novorossiya, the Donbass, areas tied to the old Kiev Rus state, which itself was one in a line of Russian capitals stretching from Ladoga to Kiev to Moscow. Everything west of that is of little interest to Russia. Europe, as it stands, has very little to offer. Deindustrialized economies, depleted resources, and societies hollowed out by mass migration and cultural decay. Whatever Russia needs from Europe, it can buy if it even wants it. For Europe's political class, however, the war is a lifeline. It justifies diverting public funds into arms contracts, provides a pretext for suppressing dissent, and offers a convenient way to ship potentially rebellious young men to the front, where many will die. If the European public ever fully realizes how brutally they have been betrayed, how their energy systems were sabotaged, their industries undercut, their savings inflated away, and their children sacrificed, then we could see the return of pitchforks and torches. A new wave of revolutions from Paris to Berlin is not impossible, and the elites know it. War against Russia, in their twisted calculus, is a way to preemptively thin out the ranks of those who might one day lead such uprisings. In Washington, under the new Trump doctrine, there has been a rhetorical shift, but not a moral one. Listen carefully to the foreign policy speeches. The line now is that Europe must step up to defend itself from the Russian threat, while the United States will stand ready to sell them the weapons. In other words, Americans get paid, Europeans bleed. Frankly, that was probably the plan from the very beginning. Ukraine was simply the appetizer, which brings us back to Zelensky in London, meeting with the leaders of Britain, France, and Germany to discuss what the New York Times innocently calls ways of ending the conflict with Russia. Let's be clear. The various proposals floated by Trump's people, by the EU, and by Kiev are not peace plans. They are instruments designed to trap Russia into a bad deal, freezing the conflict while keeping a hostile Western-armed regime in Kiev, preserving NATO leverage without addressing any of Russia's core security concerns. From Moscow's perspective, these are non-starters, and rightly so. The West still seems to believe it can somehow maneuver Russia into accepting a settlement that leaves Kiev's regime intact, keeps Western financial and military control over Ukraine, and allows NATO to regroup for the next round. Publicly, they must maintain the narrative that Russia is the biggest threat to Europe to justify everything they have done, from sanctions to censorship to economic self-harm. They cannot just drop that story overnight. So they pretend to grope toward peace, even as they scramble to send more weapons and push Ukraine to hold lines that can no longer be held. What they cannot admit is that the war is already strategically lost for them. Russia has destroyed the bulk of Ukraine's trained army, broken its fortification belts, crippled its logistics, and exposed the moral and political bankruptcy of the Western project in Ukraine. Kiev's mobilization machine is now turning inward, devouring children and women, triggering open resistance. Europe's economies are weakening. Public anger is rising. The United States would prefer to cash out, sell weapons from the sidelines, and focus on other theaters, but cannot entirely walk away without admitting defeat. So we arrive at this moment. Zelensky roaming the capitals, elites dining on caviar while their peasants scrape by. Ukrainian teenagers and young women dragged into a hopeless war. Fortress cities like Avdiivka leveled. Civilians in Donetsk still dodging rockets after a decade, and Western politicians talking about sovereignty and democracy while they treat both as expendable slogans. Russia, by contrast, continues to grind forward, methodically, focused on securing its historical lands, protecting its people in the Donbass, and avoiding needless losses among its troops. In the end, the West's greatest fear is not a Russian tank in Warsaw. It is a Ukrainian mother, an Italian worker, a German farmer, a French small businessman, People across this artificially created front, realizing who truly destroyed their livelihoods, who lied to them about the war, and who profited while their sons and daughters died. When that realization spreads, the political map of Europe will change far more dramatically than any front line on a battlefield. And on that day, the lies told about Russia and this war will come due with interest.